Welcome back. This is the third session of our study of the Intertestamental Period. We began with examining the ancient sources available for this so-called silent period, and then dug into the first of these, the book of Daniel. His historical reporting and his prophecies provide a remarkable amount of information for us. Now we come to a historical survey of those 400 years. The Jews found themselves under the domination of Persia, Greece, Egypt, and Syria, and then they were able to throw off the Syrians and enjoy a century of independence. But Rome brought that freedom to an end, and an Idumean took the throne over the Jews at Rome's behest. Before Persia, however, the Babylonian captivity set the stage. That traumatic 70 years imposed profound challenges and changes on the exiled Jews, and on Judaism itself. Let's consider what it did. Torn from their native land, they lost not only land and goods and freedom, but what they prized most, the temple of God and its sacrificial ritual. Even their children felt this loss, because it had been a daily reminder of what it was to be a Jew. Gifts to Yahweh, temple choruses, the sight and smell of the rituals. With all that gone, what was left for any observant Jew? This psalm captures that sense of despair. By the waters of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? It is not too much to say that their very Hebrew identity was at risk. Surrounded by Aramaic speakers, they might lose their native Hebrew speech. If they should be forced to assimilate, Judaism might fade away. History has seen it happen. Explorers to the New World found on the island of Newfoundland a culture called Beothuk. Their practices included coloring their clothing and occasionally their bodies with red ochre. But forced inland, they lost their fishing-based livelihood. Soon, their dwindling population was assimilated into other Native American tribes, and its identity was lost. The one thing they left in the encroaching culture's memory was the idea that Indians are red. That notion survives to this day, despite the predominant skin tone of Native Americans. For the Jews in Babylon, we see that the profession of scribe became most prominent. We might have thought priests would have this role, but with the loss of the sacrificial system, priests had little to offer the exiles, while scribes did. It fell to them to preserve the one thing Judaism had left, their scriptures. They had to be kept safe, and copies had to be made. And reading, teaching, and interpreting the Torah became the center of a once sacrificial-based culture. Scribes became custodians of Jewish tradition. There was another profound change that occurred among the exiles, the genesis of the synagogue. Its origin is obscure, but it almost surely can be found in the time of the exile. This statement in Malachi suggests it. Then those who feared the Lord spoke with one another. The Lord paid attention and heard them, and a book of remembrance was written before him of those who feared the Lord and esteemed his name. They shall be mine, says the Lord of hosts, in the day when I make up my treasured possession, and I will spare them as a man spares his son who serves him. Well, whatever its origin, did it serve as a substitute for the temple? I'd say certainly not. Its purpose was totally different and suited for a people whose lifestyle had been changed dramatically. Now, as we know, Cyrus the Great ended the long exile of the Jews, and they returned under new masters. That regime was relatively benign, lasting some 2 centuries. Here's a timeline. The return to Palestine consisted of 3 waves, each associated with one leader. The first left Babylon with Zerubbabel in 539 BC, with the goal of restoring the temple. Urged on by the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, the people achieved this within about 25 years. Persian history is less familiar to most than Greek and Roman events, so here are some of those for comparison. Darius' attack on Greece failed on the plain of Marathon. A decade later, Xerxes did no better. Slowed by the heroic and tragic Spartan 300 at Thermopylae, and then defeated in the naval engagement at Salamis, his attempt to subdue Greece ended in disgrace on the field at Plataea. It may have been Queen Esther's role to console the king after that debacle. History associates the second returning wave with Ezra the priest and scribe, 80 or so years after Zerubbabel. His zeal for the Torah brought repentance and reforms. Then came the king's cupbearer, Nehemiah, leading the third wave in 445 BC. Under his direction, the walls of Jerusalem were rebuilt. That generation also saw the last of the Old Covenant prophets, Malachi. Well, as we know, the Persian Empire falls to the Greeks and Alexander the Great. This timeline shows key events in his story, from his birth in 356 BC to his death in Babylon at age 33. He races across the world, winning battle after battle against all kinds of opponents, an 11-year crusade to conquer the known world. It's fair to ask, I think, how'd he and they do it? If there is one answer for that, it would be this: the Macedonian phalanx. Now, the Greeks had used a compact formation in battle, rather like that, for a couple of 100 years before Alexander. But the Macedonians changed the formation in 2 crucial ways. First, they replaced the doru, the Greek lance, which was some 7 to 8 feet long, with the sarissa, about 18 feet in length. Second, they quadrupled the size of the Greek phalanx from about 8 troops wide and 8 deep to 16 by 16. And the details of that formation were significant. The first 5 rows held their sarissas down, pointed at the enemy. That meant that the enemy faced 80 spear points, a veritable porcupine. The remaining 11 ranks held their sarissas up. That's 176. Any incoming arrows, rocks, or other missiles could be deflected or stopped when a dozen or so troops brought their spear points together to meet them. Now, a whole phalanx would not charge. It would be too hard to maintain the formation. They could advance slowly, but they were primarily defensive, and the phalanxes arrayed obliquely to the left, luring the enemy to shift rightward. They called this the anvil. When the enemy were fully engaged with them, the hammer struck. Around the right flank swooped the cavalry, striking the thinning portion of the enemy body. This basic tactic won the field for them every time. It was something their opponents had never seen before, and it carried them all the way to India. Here's a sketch of their battles. After the death of his father, Philip II of Macedon, the 18-year-old Alexander faced a rebellion from the Greeks his father had subdued. He turned his troops against Thebes, the instigator of the revolt, breached its walls, burnt the city, massacred thousands of Thebans, and sold hundreds into slavery. He spared one house in the city, the house of the poet Pindar. Having studied as a boy under Aristotle, Alexander knew excellence in the arts when he encountered it. Then came the dramatic moment. Setting out to the east, he cast a spear into Asia, declaring war on the Persian Empire. He visits Troy and sacrifices at the tomb of Achilles there. Predictably, since he believes he is the reincarnation of that legendary hero. Then, at the Granicus River, he meets the first Persian resistance and routs them. In Central Asia Minor, he visits Gordium, having heard that a Phrygian king had tied a baffling knot on a cart frame, a knot that a seer claimed only the one who would rule all Asia could unravel. There are two traditions about his actions there. The best known and later tradition said he just split it with his sword. But the earlier and better one says he did untie it. He removed the linchpin and pulled the two beams apart, exposing the ends of the knot. And another legend about him was born. He met a larger Persian force at Issus and routed it as well, then turned south to subdue Tyre and Gaza. The Jewish historian Josephus tells us that he approached Jerusalem and was met by a procession of priests. And when the book of Daniel was showed him, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, he supposed that himself was the person intended. Pleased, he does not harm the city. Then Egypt welcomes him and proclaims him a god. The following year, he meets the greatest army Darius can muster at Arbela. He crushes it and kills the king, leaving the kingdom open for him to visit and loot its three capitals, Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis. At Susa, he has many of his officers to marry local women. He wants to fuse his conquests into an organic whole. And so, in Central Asia, he himself marries a Bactrian princess, Roxanne. She will later bear him a son. Pressing on, he crosses the Indus River, fighting and defeating an Indian prince's army. But then his own soldiers, weary and missing home and family, just refused to go on. And so they make the long trek back. At Babylon, Alexander succumbs to a fever. Asked by his generals, "To whom do you leave your empire?" he says, "To Kratisto," to the strongest. Then history becomes about his successors. Daniel's prophecy tells about this. "And as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the four winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the authority with which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others besides these." Not to his posterity, yes. Roxanne, Alexander IV, whom she bears after her husband's death, and Philip Arvidaeus, his half-brother, will eventually all be murdered in the struggle for power. 4 of his generals will divide up the empire, with Cassander taking Macedonia, Lysimachus getting Thrace and most of Asia Minor, Seleucus seizing the bulk of the empire, and Ptolemy taking Egypt. The uneasy agreement erupts into war when Ptolemy steals the body of Alexander, being taken to Macedonia, and buries it in Egypt. In the ensuing years, Cassander and Lysimachus fade from view, leaving Seleucus and Ptolemy to face off against one another. And then there were 2. These 2 empires shared an important trade route, which was also their only common border, and Israel was right there. For the next century and a half, their armies would struggle over that border. Egypt dominated for nearly a century, and then the Seleucids would be ascendant. How did the Jews fare amid this? Well, Ptolemy I Soter pushed north against his rival and seized Jerusalem by exploiting the Jews' Sabbath when they would not resist. Josephus quotes a pagan historian about that. "There is a nation called Jews, who have a strong and great city called Jerusalem, which they allowed to fall into the hands of Ptolemy by refusing to take up arms, and instead, through their untimely superstition, submitted to having a hard master." Ptolemy used his victory to deport about 100,000 Jews, some as slaves, but most to serve in his army. His successor, Ptolemy Philadelphus, treated the Jews well, respecting their laws and traditions. He also authorized the translation of the Torah into Greek, since by his time so many Jews had adopted that language. Ptolemy Philopator, though also respecting the Jews, let his curiosity draw him into attempting to enter the Holy of Holies. Jewish tradition says he was struck by paralysis for his attempt, but this led him to persecute them. Then the Seleucids began to prevail. After seizing Israel, Antiochus III was at first favorable to the Jews, but his ambitious attempt to conquer Greece brought him up against the rising power of Rome. He was defeated and forced to pay a huge indemnity. His successor inherited that debt, motivating him to attempt to rob Jerusalem's temple. but protests caused him to back off. Then, as the Seleucids continued to hold sway over the trade route, came Antiochus IV. We will see a little about him here, and much more later. I'll just sketch the next century, since we will examine it in more detail in other sessions. Antiochus IV, in his 10-year reign, invades Egypt twice with limited success. On his third attempt, he finds that the Romans have an interest in this part of the Mediterranean world. At the border of Egypt, he is met by an envoy from Rome, Gaius Popilius Laenas. He is not a soldier and leads no troops, but he tells Antiochus that the Senate and the people of Rome expect him to withdraw immediately. Nonplussed, Antiochus says he will consult his advisers. Laenas then takes his staff and draws a circle in the sand around the Seleucid king. I will have your answer before you step out of that circle, he states. Utterly humiliated, Antiochus withdraws. On his return to his kingdom, though, he will vent his frustration on the Jews. About that, much more to come. The outrages he commits finally bring the Jews to a revolt. It begins with a minor priest in the little village of Modin named Mattathias. A Seleucid officer is going from village to village, demanding that each build an altar to Zeus and sacrifice to the god on it. Mattathias responds, "Though all nations obey the king, I and my sons and my brothers will walk in the covenant of our fathers." Another village leader steps forward to comply with the demand, and Mattathias kills him on the spot, and then the Seleucid officer. Then he calls out, "Whoever is zealous for the law and stands by the covenant, follow me." Then he and his 5 sons flee to the hills to begin guerrilla warfare. Judas will lead the rebellion first, earning the nickname Maccabeus, the hammer of God. An amazing tactician, he leads a small force to outmaneuver, outflank, and outsmart one Seleucid force after another. Within 3 years, he is in Jerusalem to cleanse the temple. Upon his death, his brother Jonathan takes the lead. He too is a warrior, but also a diplomat, playing various Seleucid contenders against each other to the Jews' advantage. When his brother Simon succeeds him, the Jews actually achieve independence and grow strong and prosperous. Simon is then the first of the so-called Hasmonean rulers. His son John follows his father's example, and the Jews prosper under him. The next 2, Aristobulus and Jannaeus, are, however, greedy, corrupt, and cruel. And then Jannaeus' wife inherits the throne, and the Jews call her 9-year reign a golden age. But it ends when a dynastic struggle leads Rome to finally step in, and Judea will become a province of the newest empire. We'll be looking at each stage of this intertestamental period over the next few sessions, and noting profound changes that they produced in the lives, beliefs, and expectations of the Jewish people. I hope you will join us then. If you have questions about this lecture, or any of the others in this series, you may address them to me, Dr. Jerry C. 4 at yahoo.com.